From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Drive through some communities in Colorado, and your movements may be monitored by a network of cameras that track your license plate. A company called Flock operates dozens of these cameras in Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins, and they've quietly photographed millions of cars over the last year. And right now, these cities are grappling with the question of whether these cameras help fight crime or are an abuse of privacy and civil liberties. Denver leaders announced in February they would not renew the city's contract with Flock. Officials in Boulder and Fort Collins are also considering dropping their use of Flock cameras after public opposition. To better understand the debate over these cameras, we reached out to Stephen Keener. He's an assistant professor of criminology at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. He studies the use of Flock cameras across the U.S. and how that data has been used or misused by law enforcement, as well as some of the philosophical objections to the cameras.
I think that these cameras in particular really violate a fundamental assumption that we have. If we're doing what we're supposed to do, if we're not breaking the law, if we're not providing probable cause, the government and police are supposed to leave us alone. Like, we are supposed to have a certain expectation of privacy. But in reality, the vast majority of data being captured by these cameras are people just living their everyday law-abiding life.
Flock cameras are usually mounted on poles, or you might see them on walls close to streets. The cameras scan license plates and sometimes bumper stickers. Stephen, briefly, what happens after the Flock camera photographs your license plate?
So we call this a vehicle fingerprint. And so it can recognize the make and model of your car, bumper stickers, if you have like certain additions on your car, all of that. An image is captured, is then sent to a police database. And usually with that, there is a timestamp and a location of where that photo was taken and the time. But from there, they can integrate that picture with other surveillance data they have coming from things like traffic cameras, speed cameras, CCTV. And it is a pretty expansive database of both real-time pictures being captured as well as historical tracking data.
Now, privacy and civil liberties advocates have major concerns about how this data is used. What are a couple of examples of ways that you've seen data misused after a Flock camera photographs a car?
Yeah, so it's a couple different categories, and probably the most concerning of which has been the way it's been abused, particularly by law enforcement. For example, we've seen across the country officers using, I'm going to refer to them as ALPRs a lot. So that's automatic license plate reader cameras.
Okay.
And Flock Safety is the predominant form of ALPR cameras. And so we've seen officers across the country use ALPR data to stalk exes, ex-partners. We've seen them stalk their ex-partner's new partner. We also had an incident where in Texas, there was a search for a woman they thought was seeking an abortion out of state. And they're actually using the ALPR data to try to track where she went and if she tried to do that. So there's those abuses by law enforcement. We've also seen quite a few technical issues as well and misreads. For example, there was a family that was held at gunpoint because of a misread of an ALPR camera that thought the vehicle was stolen. In some of these cases, got pretty aggressive and violent.
So Denver leaders decided late last year they would stop using Flock cameras after learning ICE officers had accessed information from a database maintained by Flock Safety, which builds the cameras. This is despite Flock's assurance that the company doesn't share that data. How was ICE able to get that information?
So the most common way they're getting that information is through what we call a side door. And they're essentially just finding a friendly police officer that's willing to give them access to the database. So if you're a law enforcement department that has a contract with Flock, you can opt into their regional and national sharing database. And so in those cases, if you opt in, the pictures that are taken by your ALPR cameras are shared across the country and is now accessible to law enforcement agencies across the country. In some instances, which we also saw in Virginia, this past summer, we saw ICE access 5 different localities, Flock databases in Virginia. And that was through these side doors where they there was somebody willing to give them access to the database. And once they had access to one portal of entry, they now had access to this expansive national database. This is frustrating on a number of levels. One, like you said, we have heard from Flock that this is not going on. There is not sharing with the federal government, even though we continue to see that it's happening. Mm-hmm. And in many of these cases, when you ask law enforcement if they knew this was going on, sometimes you'll see law enforcement leaders say, no, they did not know it, that they would not have given them access if they did know it was going on. And there's also this question of, what if they just came to a local department and said, hey, we are a federal law enforcement agency. Federal law trumps state laws and local laws. So can we access your database? Yeah. And there's a reasonable argument to be made that that would be the case, that they would also have a legal avenue into getting access to this, which I think is quite concerning.
Stephen, law enforcement and city leaders often say flock cameras help reduce crime. Mm-hmm. What does the research show about the camera's ability to prevent crime?
There is no peer-reviewed empirical study that can make that argument. And that's because of a lot of reasons. One, crime is complicated, and why crime happens is complicated. Two, there has been a reduction in crime rates almost across the board, across the country. Not everywhere, but most localities are seeing it. Those are in those localities that have flock cameras and localities that do not have flock cameras. Crime is going down everywhere. But also, these cameras, if they're being used by law enforcement, it is to find somebody after the fact, you'll be able to track somebody down. But when it comes to crime prevention, that does not connect at all with what we know from historical research on why crime happens, especially violent crime. If we want to prevent violent crime, it's going to have to involve things like reducing inequality, youth-focused programs, violence interrupters, those kind of actual preventive mechanisms.
Well, you mentioned flock cameras can help recover stolen vehicles and solve other serious crimes. And I think supporters might say that's pretty important. How should residents weigh that potential benefit against these concerns that you've mentioned?
I would make the argument that the concerns far outweigh the benefits. Like when we see these kinds of abuses that happen, when we see a police officer and even police chief using it to stalk ex-partners and their new partners, that to me is pretty terrifying. The fact that we know that ICE and other federal agencies were accessing this data, even when we were being told that they were not able to do that, I think is extremely concerning. Also, we've seen in a number of localities where during the No Kings protest, ALPR data was accessed as a way to try to track protesters. Who came to the protest? Where did they go after? And I think that is a clear suppression of free speech. All of those are actual abuses that we've already seen come to light and come to fruition, and they continue to happen. And so I would argue that mass surveillance in general, but particularly this form of mass surveillance, makes us far less safe than more safe.
Stephen Keener is assistant professor of criminology at Christopher Newport University in Virginia, where he's also the director of the Center for Crime, Equity, and Justice Research and Policy. You can read more of his research into flock cameras and the debate over the future of the cameras in Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins. We'll have links in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.